Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast with John and Hannah.
Hi.
And for this Friend or Foe Friday, we're going to be talking about a suggestion that was given to us by Joe Richter of the Hindsightless podcast. Thanks very much for that, Joe. And Joe suggested that we might like to look at the fey creatures known as Redcaps. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so it actually took us a little bit of searching to find Redcaps in terms of the actual games, D&D, because we normally like to start off by talking what the creatures are like in D&D, both more recent editions and older editions, and then sort of head on into mythology and inspiration of that. But we actually had to go to the Volo's Guide to Monsters in 5th edition and Monster Manual 3 in D&D 3.5 to find a mention of Redcaps. There may be a mention of them in AD&D 2nd edition, but certainly there isn't in the main Monster Manual, and I don't have a vast library of AD&D stuff with which to consult. But if you know where the Redcaps are and you've got any further information, feel free to call in and let us know. So, Love, you've got the Monster Manual 3 there from D&D 3.5. What does that say about Redcaps?
So, Redcaps are the most evil fae you're ever likely to meet. It gives you a description of a redcap. Short guy, hunched over, scary teeth, looks like a tough old man. On their heads they've got a bright red hat which is wet with their victim's blood, and they have a certain amount of time before that cap will dry out. If it dries out, they'll die, so they have to go and keep killing people and dipping their hats in the blood. I
was going to say that ties in pretty much with the description of the Redcap from Volo's Guide to Monsters for 5th edition. There are homicidal fey creatures that look like wizened old men with sharp implements, wearing sort of iron boots, although they look more like new rocks in the 5th edition picture. And as Hannah said, they have their hats soaked in the blood of their enemies. However, in 5th edition, they've added this thing in where these creatures are tied in with the Feywild, which obviously came into prominence in 4th edition and 5th edition. And in 5th edition, they can actually be created when a sentient creature acts on an intense desire for bloodshed. If they kill somebody or a number of people, and where the blood is shed, Redcaps might be spawned, and they appear as like little red mushrooms, which is like their caps poking out of the ground. And when moonlight shines on them, these sort of wizened, gnomish creatures spring up. And as Hannah was saying, they have to keep their hoods wet with blood, otherwise, according to 5th edition, they just cease to exist.
Now, in 3rd ed, they reproduce by budding. It specifically says that they're asexual and reproduce by budding.
So they've still got a sort of plant theme going,
Yeah, so it happens once or twice in their life, and they basically develop like a hump on their back that becomes a wart, drops off, sprouts their head and legs, and grows to full size within a year. And they sound quite nasty, actually. We've got young redcap and elder redcap listed here. I don't know if you've got two different varieties.
No.
Or does it work that way for 5th?
No, I know in 3.5, like, the more they kill, like, the harder they get, basically, the more hit dice they get. That doesn't seem to be the case in 5th edition. We've just got, like, the one set of stats for them, but obviously you could sort of upscale them if you wanted to.
You've also got the advancement notes on this for if you did want to have a redcap as like a recurring character. I think, there's also a really strange bit in here about redcap superstitions, which is very 2nd ed, and I wonder if that's a holdover from something in an earlier edition.
What's it saying?
So they believe rivers contain water spirits that can snatch their souls, so they only bathe in still water. Odd little superstition, fair enough. Yeah. They're dubious of even-numbered quantities and always travel in odd-numbered groups. No redcap will ever carry an even number of coins in its pouch. Now that just strikes me as being one of those things that's left over from somebody's 2nd ed game, where they or somebody's like pre-1st ed game even, where they outsmarted the redcap by paying it an even amount of coins so that it'd have an odd number of coins, so that it'd be an even number of coins, or something like that. I think
there's possibly a bit of that, but obviously we've got to consider as well that this was like Monster Manual 3, so it's the 3rd Monster Manual they've done. If you look at it, the redcaps in 3.5, they've got like a double page spread. So I think maybe they needed something to fill in a little bit of the space.
Indeed,
whereas in 5th edition, it's just one page. You've got a little picture and the stat block taking up one column, and you've got like the special abilities taking up the other column. So it's nice and compact.
There's also a nice little thing on here. When a Redcap dies, it leaves behind a single tooth. Anyone wearing this tooth gains +2 circumstance bonus on charisma checks when dealing with Fae, and +4 when dealing with other Redcaps. That's quite a handy little bit of kit if you were able to pick one up in game.
Now, it doesn't say anything specifically about what happens when Redcaps die in here. It does say that if they don't replenish their blood once every 3 days, they just vanish as though they'd never existed. So whether when you kill them they just vanish, I suppose that's up to the individual GM, really. Yeah, it's quite an interesting idea, that. Also,
3rd Ed, always nice to have those quick little descriptions for the official campaign settings. So you've got a bit of Redcaps in Eberron, which is basically just saying, oh, the dwarves in Eberron don't like them, and they live in these mountains, and Redcaps in Faerun, and how they're nuisances to the halflings of Lurien. Just a nice little thing that's in the 3rd Ed book that isn't in the 2nd Ed or the 5th.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've definitely tried to sort of like push specific campaign settings less. Yeah, I mean, even though this is Volo's guide and Volo is associated with the Forgotten Realms and Faerun, they've tried to make things a bit more sort of general purpose in 5th edition, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, because it means you can easily drop it into your campaigns. But I've got to admit, I do like those little sort of like, oh, here's some ideas for different campaign settings that you can use.
So the other book that we've got that includes Redcaps is Changeling the Dreaming. And John, you've played this a lot more than me, so do you want to tell us about Redcaps in Changeling?
Yeah, no problems. Okay, so if you're not familiar with it, Changing the Dreaming is one of the sort of original World of Darkness books, or whatever they're calling it now. I know they're calling it World of Darkness, but whatever. And it was always one that stuck out to me as being slightly at odds with the feeling of the other World of Darkness games, whereas the other ones tend to be sort of very sort of run down and everything's dark and depressing. Your blood-sucking creatures of the night, your werewolf struggling against a world that's spiralling into chaos. In Changing the Dreaming, you played these creatures who were sort of in tune with the last sparks of imagination that were present in the world, and you could see into this chimerical realm of dream and imagination creatures. And although you looked like humans, you had a fairy seeming, which was your sort of fey self. Now, in this game, Redcaps were one of the fairy types that you can play. They're described as the stuff of nightmares. They're supposed to be vulgar and disgusting, and many of the Kithain, as they were called, the fairies, believe that Redcaps are actually nightmares given form. They tend to associate with mortal gangs and any people who achieve their aims by violence and terror. Now, unlike trolls, which are also available in the game, who are like your honourable sort of warriors and your stout sort of defenders, Redcaps were just out and out sort of violent psychopaths. Obviously mostly linked with the Unseelie Court. No surprises there. Apparently there were supposed to be some Seelie Redcaps, but they were quite rare, but they were despised by their Unseelie brethren and hunted down. So no wonder they were rare, to be honest. The description of them is that Redcaps tend towards stocky build, with greyish mottled skin and thick bandy legs. Even Seelie Redcaps have horrid bloodshot eyes, skeletal noses and rubbery wrinkled faces. Worst of all are their ghoulish mouths filled with yellow, crooked, flat teeth used for grinding and ripping. One of the odd things about this is that even though they're called Redcaps, there's no real mention of the red cap, and the picture doesn't have the red cap wearing a red cap. So that's a little bit weird, but their abilities related to like eating things and inflicting violence on things and intimidation. So they were thoroughly unpleasant fellows. Okay, so as well as our various roleplay books, we've also done a bit of research online and in our non-roleplay reference material. So if you look at the Wikipedia page for Redcap, it describes them as a type of malevolent, murderous goblins, and says that they're often found in border folklore, so mainly on the sort of Anglo-Scottish border, especially where like battles or there were deeds of tyranny or wicked acts were performed. And it also says that being known for dipping their caps in the blood of victims. Redcap, which is sometimes described as a species, sometimes described as a singular person, was also known as red comb or bloody cap, for obvious reasons. The description given is a short, thick-set old man with long prominent teeth, skinny fingers, talons like eagles, large eyes of fiery red, grizzly hair, iron boots, some sort of staff in his hand and a red cap on his head. So we can see there various different elements that have been pulled out from the sort of popular mythology for D&D and other games. Although, as we said when we were talking about changing the dreaming, they each tend to select the characteristics that are most appealing for their games. So in 5th edition, where you're going for your sort of goblin, fey type creature that's going to oppose the characters, they've got the big iron boots, sharp weapons, fangs, the bloody cap, etc. In Changeling the Dreaming, where they were available as a player option, they've still got the teeth and they've got the claws, but the bloody cap's nowhere to be seen. So, to cut a long story short, in various folklore, the red cap is described alternatively as like a dwarf, a gnome, or a small goblin, a tiny, stunted man, and they're always associated with violent death, conflict, and obviously blood. Now, love, you've been looking at our copy of Lore of the Land. What does it say in there about red caps?
So it has a legend from Northamptonshire
Okay.
in 1851, which is a story that I have heard many times before, but I've always heard it as being a leprechaun. Which is 3 brothers who've poached some of the king's deer, and the red cap keeps coming and asking them for some broth, and the first 2 brothers refuse it, but then the 3rd brother, because he's the wise young brother, knows that if he catches the red cap will give him some treasure, so he does.
Okay.
You
nice
know,
and straightforward.
it's one of those old folk stories. It's then got a list of like other places where similar stories are told. Rockingham, Barnhill, Stamford, Kettering, Duttington. But this describes it as the red man or red cap.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's red man like it's a social designation.
Oh, right, okay.
You know, I'm not quite sure.
Possibly like
what,
a slur for a particular ethnicity.
Yeah,
or
we're
something.
1851, it might actually be red man, in which case it might just be that the law of the land's getting a bit mixed up there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult whenever you sort of start delving back into these things, because you tend to find that a lot of similar sort of creatures exist, and they often get confused, or the characteristics are taken from one and pulled into another. So, what did our big encyclopedia of myths and legends say about red caps?
Red cap, a malevolent castle goblin. He is said to dye his cap in human blood.
Well, I mean, obviously that's a brief description, but it's actually quite interesting. So I'm looking on the Wikipedia page now, and it's describing a man by the name of Lord William de Sul, who was Lord of Liddesdale and Butler of Scotland, a Scottish border noble during the War of Scottish Independence. And in the Red Cap page, it describes him as having a familiar, so you know, like a sorceress helper called Robin Redcap, who was said to have wrought much harm and ruin on the lands of his master's dwelling, Hermitage Castle. Ultimately, William was, according to legend, taken to the 9-stane rig, the stone circle near the castle, wrapped in lead and boiled to death. In reality, he was actually imprisoned in Dumbarton Castle, and he died there following his confessed complicity in conspiracy against Robert the Bruce in 1320. But there we go again, we've got that idea of the sort of border place, you know, where violent acts have been inflicted, but also we see the first link between redcaps and sorcery, which I could sort of see how that might lead into the whole idea of them being fae. You know, there was often supposed to be a lot of mythology about fae, sorcerers communing with fae and getting in touch with other realms and stuff like that.
It does rather make me wonder whether red cap is actually a euphemism for ginger, since we're talking about the between Scotland and England conflicts.
It's quite possible, I suppose.
Obviously, it's quite difficult sometimes when we come up against things when we're looking at the origins of real world myths. Because, quite often we do come up against this whole, turns out it was actually just British people being racist. There's not really fairies or even some like old myths of fairies. It was just British people being racist. Sorry about that, guys. We do try our best to at least be honest about it when we find this stuff out.
Yeah. So that's a little bit of a sort of delve into some of the myths surrounding Redcaps. So in terms of how you could potentially use them in a more interesting way in the game, I think a great place to start would be the 5th edition idea that they sort of spring out of the ground like mushrooms when like a dark deed's been performed.
Absolutely. I could see that making for a fantastic like one-off campaign in the sort of Gremlins Critters style, where you've got like a serial killer did a murder in the house and then the family move in, or something happened in the frat house and then the kids are getting chased around, or cabin in the woods.
Well, it's quite a sort of tried and tested formula in sort of myths and legends, that when someone commits a crime, the evidence of their misdeed comes back to haunt them. Obviously we've got Edgar Allan Poe, various other legends throughout time, but I could see the Redcaps being used for that role. So, I mean, certainly, I think it's in 5th edition, it describes that some Redcaps have like a link with the person who led to their creation, and some of them try and hunt them down and kill them as the first victim.
Absolutely.
Others actually just follow them around, hoping they're going to do more murder and they can help with it.
Yeah. So either way, that's an interesting thing to do if one of your players has gone a bit overboard on the NPCs, how many hit points for the farmer.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it could be quite interesting as well. Is obviously you could do the whole thing of like, you've got like a murder hobo PC who's like murdering everyone left, right and centre for that sweet XP, and then you have a Redcap show up and try and kill him because he's created the Redcap. But I think it'd be just as interesting because it describes like if a lot of people are killed, sometimes more than one of them springs up. I think it could be just as interesting having a group of Redcaps spawned by a player character turn up and actually be quite friendly to the player character. However, everywhere the player goes, they're going to be wanting to murder people.
Yeah.
Which, even if you look at it from, if you ignore the repugnant sort of social aspect of it, the player's going to get annoyed with that because the player's not getting any XP for the people that the Redcap are murdering. And also, if they think it's bad when like the player character occasionally murders someone and they get the city guard on the case, imagine what it's going to be like when they've got like a small unit of Redcaps following around and just like murdering everyone.
Who have to kill somebody every few days or they'll die themselves.
Yeah. And how many times is it going to be when the players go up to an NPC to talk to them? Maybe they're going into a tavern and they're just like, oh, can I have a drink? Redcap leaps out from behind and murders the tavern keeper. How many times is that going to happen before the player character gets really annoyed with that? I don't think it's many, to be honest. And then you've also got the interesting idea of how do they deal with that? Because the Redcaps, they're quite tasty, so they could be quite useful in certain circumstances, but is it worth the price you're paying for that? So I think that could be quite an interesting thing. I also quite like the idea of, because they're often described as like goblins or like dwarves or gnomes or whatever, I quite like the idea of maybe the Redcaps are sort of were originally goblins or gnomes or dwarves that have somehow been like corrupted by, in a sort of like Wendigo style, you commit some sort of horrible deed and it transforms you into a Redcap, or maybe like, there's a whole idea of like Wendigo, they get possessed by like winter spirits or spirits of starvation, maybe like a spirit of violence or a bloodlust or something like that infects the victim. They open the door through their evil act. So I could see that as a sort of interesting. Maybe you do a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde story on it. Maybe because they describe moonlight is what allows them to be born in 5th edition. Maybe this local dwarf killed someone on the sly, and every time it's a full moon, in a sort of werewolf style, he turns into a Redcap, merrily goes around a murdering, wakes up in his bed the next morning, no real evidence of it, or maybe he's covering up the evidence and he doesn't know why he's waking up with blood on him, but he's unaware what's going on. So you've got the interesting dichotomy there of like, yeah, they committed whatever the original evil deed was, but did they deserve to be turned into this creature, and are they responsible for the acts that they perform whilst they've turned into this creature? I think that could be pretty interesting.
You've also got, obviously, the broken down castles along the Scottish border as being a really interesting setting. I mean, that's just begging for a sort of a horror game with people camping out there, like in Dog Soldiers.
Oh, yeah.
Or what else could you do with it? It could also make for like an interesting story for if you've got a Cthulhu game, is it, that has an archaeologist as one of the character classes?
Yeah.
That could make for quite an interesting story to pitch for that character.
Yeah.
go and investigate this spooky Scottish castle. Oh, there's some redcaps and something undescribably evil.
I think as well, like, it's interesting you mentioned spooky castles, because I think you could use it for a nice sort of bait and switch here. So obviously if you say, oh, there's an old ass spooky castle and like a big battle took place nearby and loads of people died, now recently like farmers in the local area have started going missing or whatever, the players are going to be like, undead, ghosts, and maybe they turn up there and it's not undead or ghosts, it's these redcap, but maybe the acts of violence was so depraved in this bat that like the blood that seeped into the ground is still giving rise to the odd redcap even years later. And yeah, okay, most of the time they can't get their hands on anyone and they just pop out of existence, but okay, recently for some reason one of them's popped up and he's managed to keep himself going. Maybe he's like become a bit more powerful like in 3.5, or maybe he's just been lucky, who knows. And perhaps his violence has given rise to more redcaps. So there's now like a whole, I suppose, burgeoning community of murderous redcaps. So like in the style of like the horror film, you know, where you've got like the old sort of like hick family who are sort of like being raised up and murdering people and eating them or whatever. Maybe you've got redcaps doing the same. So the players go, they've got the cleric tooled up, ready to turn undead. They go in and it's a load of like these sort of hillbilly ass like murderous redcaps there. What do they do? I think that could be quite interesting because the clerics turn undead ain't going to do shit against a redcap. So I think you could do that. However, I would advise if you're going to do a bait and switch like that, you should definitely put some clues that it's not just undead. Because if all of the sort of misleading clues lead people to think it's going to be undead, they tool up, they take all the holy water, they spend all their money on silver crucifixes and whatever, they rock up and you're like, actually it's redcaps. They're probably going to be a bit nasty off with you, to be perfectly honest. But if you seed some clues through, maybe the players will work out that it's not undead, or maybe they're able to sort of crack that mystery, and that will give them a great sense of achievement. And if they do crack it, they can research, well, what do we know about redcaps? What other creatures could be doing this? And that could be quite an interesting thing for a sort of a more investigative character to get involved in and have their time in the spotlight.
And similarly, and you could also adapt this myth for like a sci-fi idea.
Oh yeah,
you could make it some sort of asexual life form that reproduces very quickly, that eats an awful lot.
Well, in
like a tribble but with bigger teeth.
Well, in like Games Workshop, the orcs in like Warhammer 40,000, they reproduce via spores, and basically the more orcs there are, and the more, because when they shed spores, they sort of terraform the place where the spores land. So the first things born from are like your squigs and your goblins and stuff like that. And then as it sort of terraforms the place, later on, orcs start being born. And the more orcs there are and the more powerful they get, they sort of stimulate more of these spores to like create orcs. So they're pretty similar. Yeah, I think that could be really interesting. Obviously, also, if you wanted to have your characters go into the Feywild or the realms of the fairy, perhaps the redcaps have been sent to sort of clear the way for unseelie Fey or something like that. Maybe they're like their assassins or their brute squad that they're sending forward to clean out the castle so the Fey can come and claim it, so that it could be like the first stroke of an incursion from the fairy realms. Maybe when the redcaps disappear, if they don't commit murder, maybe they actually just wink back into the Fey realms. Maybe the player characters can follow them if they needed to. Perhaps the redcaps have committed loads of murder, but actually they've been sent on some other mission by their Fey superiors, and they've actually taken someone back with them into Fairy, like kidnapped them. Maybe you want to follow them and try and rescue that person. I think there's quite a few possibilities with that. Or maybe, as in the case of William de Solis and his legends about his redcap familiar, maybe a particularly bloodthirsty sorcerer or wizard has managed to, or maybe a warlock who's got a pact with the Fey, has managed to summon one of these creatures as their familiar, thinking, oh great, I'll have this really hard combat Fey. But now they're like, oh, I've got to make sure they kill someone like every 3 days. Perhaps you're hired by the warlock who's like, I can't get rid of this thing. I need your help to like help me find some way of getting rid of it.
Well, yeah, and it does present an interesting ethical dilemma, because who are you to say that the redcap doesn't have the right to continue its existence?
Yeah.
And if the only way to do that is to keep killing people, maybe it's better to provide it with suitable people. But then that's a whole other ethical debate, isn't it, for your characters? You could get some really interesting roleplay out of it.
Yeah, and I think what I really like about the redcaps as depicted in D&D is the fact that they're not, although they're portrayed as sort of like these violent killers, they don't just kill because, obviously they do enjoy it, but they don't just kill because they enjoy it. They literally have to kill someone every few days or they cease to exist. And I'm not saying that makes them sympathetic, because obviously they're murderous killers, but but it makes them understandable. Because if they were just like randomly violent creatures who turned up and like started murdering, you could be like, oh well, yeah, kill them without any moral dilemma, that's fine. But these creatures literally have to kill for their survival. They can't, a redcap can't just turn around one day and go, do you know what, I've had enough of killing, I'm not going to do it. Well, they can, but they will then cease to exist. And I can't picture any species not having at least some sort of self-preservation instinct.
So picture this, you play a group going through the forest when suddenly they're ambushed by some horrible villainous guy who's got all the mojo so he can beat the entire player party. And then a redcap appears out of the forest, cuts this guy's throat, dips his hat in the blood and asks if he can join your party.
Yeah, what do you do? I mean, at the start you may not know that this guy's got to kill someone every 3 days, but if you accept him in the party, he might be quite useful. He's quite tasty in combat, but is it worth having him like murdering someone every few days? I mean, maybe if you're fighting lots of villains constantly, maybe it is. Maybe you can just make sure he gets the killing blow on a villain. But where's the sort of moral line? How comfortable are your players going to be with that?
So hopefully we've given you lots of good ideas for redcaps there.
Yeah, thank you very much for suggesting that, Joe. We hope you've got some good ideas out of that episode and you found it useful. Now, if you'd like to get in touch with us, maybe suggesting a subject for a future Friend or Foe Friday episode, as Joe did, you can drop us a voicemail on SpeakPipe. There'll be a link in the description of this show, or you can send us an email. The address is rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and keep gaming.
Bye.